Captain Takeo Yamamoto stood in the communications center of the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, watching the teletype machines clatter out encrypted messages destined for fleet commanders across the Pacific. The room hummed with activity. Dozens of operators typing coded text, clerks sorting message forms, officers reviewing transmission logs. Friends, like and subscribe to the channel, and we will continue. It was the nerve center of Japan's naval communications network, and Yamamoto felt a deep pride knowing that every message passing through this room was protected by the most sophisticated encryption system in the world. The Americans and British could intercept these transmissions all they wanted. Without the cipher machine and its constantly changing key settings, the messages were nothing but meaningless gibberish. The machine in question sat on a desk near Yamamoto's station, a Type B cipher machine, though the Americans had given it a different name, Purple. It was an elegant device, about the size of a large typewriter, consisting of 2 typewriter keyboards connected by a maze of electrical circuits and telephone stepping switches. When an operator typed a plain text message on one keyboard, the machine automatically encrypted it letter by letter, with the encrypted text appearing on the second keyboard. The encryption was based on a complex system of rotor movements and switch positions that changed with every keystroke, creating patterns so intricate that Japanese cryptographers believed it would take enemy codebreakers centuries to solve, if they could solve it at all. Yamamoto had been briefed on the mathematics underlying the Purple machine when he was assigned to the Communications Division 3 years earlier. The explanation had been beyond his complete understanding, something about polyalphabetic substitution ciphers and non-repeating key sequences. But the conclusion was clear. The Purple cipher was unbreakable through conventional cryptanalysis. The number of possible key combinations was astronomical, measured in the billions or trillions. Even if an enemy captured a Purple machine intact, which seemed nearly impossible given the security protocols surrounding them, they would still need to know the daily key settings to decrypt messages. And those settings changed every day at midnight Tokyo time, distributed to authorized stations through separate secure channels. The confidence in Purple's security permeated every level of the Japanese military and diplomatic establishment. Ambassadors used Purple machines to communicate with Tokyo about sensitive negotiations. Naval commanders used them to transmit operational orders. Intelligence officers used them to report on enemy activities. The assumption was always the same. These communications were absolutely secure, readable only by intended recipients, who possessed both the machine and the current key settings. This assumption shaped Japanese strategic planning in fundamental ways. If your enemy cannot read your communications, you can coordinate complex operations across vast distances without fear of compromise. You can discuss plans openly, debate options, issue detailed orders. The Purple machine gave Japan what military planners considered an insurmountable advantage. But Captain Yamamoto, despite his pride in the system, sometimes felt a nagging unease. He'd been a student of military history before the war, and he remembered reading about supposedly unbreakable codes that had been broken, impregnable fortresses that had fallen, invincible weapons that had been defeated. Overconfidence was dangerous, his professors had taught him. The moment you believe something is impossible for your enemy is the moment you stop taking proper precautions. Yet when Yamamoto had once mentioned this concern to his superior officer, he'd been dismissed with a laugh. "The Americans are good engineers," the commander had said, "but they're not magicians. Breaking purple would require them to build a machine as complex as purple itself, without ever having seen one. It's not just difficult, it's impossible." Impossible. That word echoed in Yamamoto's mind as he watched the purple machine encrypt another message, its stepping switches clicking rhythmically as they transformed plain text into ciphertext. In December 1941, as Japanese forces prepared for simultaneous attacks across the Pacific, thousands of encrypted messages flowed through the purple system daily. Fleet movements, attack timing, target selections, diplomatic instructions, all protected by what Japanese cryptographers insisted was an unbreakable cipher. The Americans were certainly intercepting these transmissions. Japan's intelligence service knew that American listening stations in Hawaii, the Philippines, and the West Coast were recording Japanese radio traffic constantly. But interception without decryption was useless. The Americans might have thousands of encrypted Japanese messages in their files, but without the ability to read them, those messages were just noise. What Captain Yamamoto didn't know, what no one in the Japanese military knew, was that the impossible had already happened. Thousands of miles away, in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C., a small team of American codebreakers had achieved what Japanese cryptographers considered impossible. They had broken purple. Not by capturing a machine, not by stealing key settings, but by building their own purple machine from scratch, using nothing but intercepted messages and mathematical analysis. It was one of the greatest intellectual achievements in the history of cryptography, and it had been accomplished in complete secrecy. The Japanese continued to use purple, confident in its security, while American intelligence read their most sensitive communications in near real time. The story of how this impossible feat was accomplished began not in 1941, but 3 years earlier, in a small office in Washington, where a brilliant and obsessive cryptanalyst named William Friedman had started studying intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages. Friedman had noticed patterns, subtle, almost imperceptible patterns, in the encrypted text. Most cryptographers would have dismissed these patterns as statistical noise, meaningless fluctuations in random data. But Friedman had spent his entire career studying codes and ciphers, and he knew that truly random data has its own signature. The patterns he was seeing suggested that the Japanese cipher, despite its complexity, had structure. And where there was structure, there was vulnerability. It would take years of work, thousands of hours of analysis, and the construction of a machine that shouldn't have been possible to build. But Friedman believed it could be done. In December 1941, as Captain Yamamoto watched purple machines encrypt messages about the impending attack on Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers were reading those same messages, decrypted and translated into English. The intelligence didn't prevent the attack. Bureaucratic failures and disbelief prevented proper warnings from reaching commanders in Hawaii. But it demonstrated beyond doubt that purple had been compromised. The unbreakable code was broken. The impossible machine had been built. And Japan's most closely guarded secret was secret no longer. This is the story of how it happened, and why the Japanese never knew their codes were compromised until it was far too late. William Friedman sat at his desk in the munitions building, surrounded by stacks of paper covered in seemingly random letters. To anyone else, the papers would have looked like meaningless gibberish. columns of 5-letter groups, thousands of them, with no apparent pattern or structure. But Friedman saw something different. He saw a puzzle, and puzzles were what he lived for. At 46 years old, Friedman was already recognized as America's foremost cryptanalyst, the man who had revolutionized the science of code breaking by applying rigorous mathematical methods to what had previously been considered an art. He had broken dozens of encryption systems, written the definitive textbooks on cryptanalysis, and built the Army's Signal Intelligence Service from nothing into a formidable organization. Now he faced his greatest challenge yet. The papers on his desk were intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted using a new cipher system that had appeared suddenly in February 1939. The previous Japanese diplomatic code, which American cryptanalysts had called RED, had been complex, but ultimately breakable. Friedman's team had been reading RED traffic for years, giving American diplomats valuable insights into Japanese negotiating positions and strategic thinking. Then, without warning, the Japanese had switched to a completely new system. The encrypted messages looked different. The letter frequencies were different. The patterns were different. Everything was different. It was clear that Japan had deployed a new cipher machine, something far more sophisticated than the red machine. Friedman had named it Purple, continuing the color coding system, and he had made breaking it his personal mission. The challenge was extraordinary. Friedman had no access to a purple machine, no stolen key settings, no help from spies or defectors. All he had were the encrypted messages themselves, the ciphertext, and his own mathematical expertise. Traditional cryptanalysis relied on finding patterns in encrypted text that revealed information about the underlying plaintext. But Purple appeared to generate ciphertext with nearly random characteristics. The letter frequencies were flat, showing none of the distinctive patterns of natural language. There were no obvious repeated sequences that might indicate common words or phrases. The encryption seemed to change constantly, as if the cipher was different for every single letter. It was exactly what a truly secure machine cipher should look like. Most cryptanalysts would have concluded that Purple was unbreakable and moved on to easier targets. But Friedman had a fundamental insight that guided all his work. No cipher created by humans is perfect. Every encryption system, no matter how complex, contains weaknesses, subtle mathematical relationships that can be exploited by someone who knows where to look. The key was patience and systematic analysis. Friedman began by studying the structure of the encrypted messages. He noticed that Purple messages always began with a date-time group, encrypted just like the rest of the message. He also noticed that certain messages appeared to be routine diplomatic communications, daily reports, administrative messages, standard greetings. These messages likely contained predictable language, stereotyped phrases that appeared in message after message. This gave Friedman his first opening. If he could guess the content of certain messages, a technique called cribbing in cryptanalysis, he could compare the known plain text with the encrypted ciphertext and potentially discover relationships between them. He started with date-time groups, which followed predictable formats. A message sent on the 15th of March at 1000 hours would begin with a date-time group that Friedman could guess with reasonable confidence. By comparing his guessed plaintext with the actual ciphertext, He could begin mapping how purple transformed specific letters at specific positions in the message. It was painstaking work, requiring thousands of comparisons and careful record-keeping. But gradually patterns began to emerge. Friedman discovered that purple didn't encrypt all letters the same way. The machine appeared to divide the alphabet into two groups, one group of 6 letters and another group of 20 letters, and encrypt each group using different methods. This was a crucial insight. It meant that purple wasn't a simple rotor machine like the German Enigma, which Friedman had studied. Instead, it used some kind of hybrid system with different encryption mechanisms for different letters. This explained why the ciphertext statistics looked so unusual. The 6-letter group and the 20-letter group had different frequency distributions, and when combined, they created the flat, apparently random distribution that made purple seem unbreakable. Understanding the structure was one thing, actually breaking the cipher was another. Friedman needed to figure out exactly how purple encrypted each group of letters, and that required understanding the machine's internal mechanism without ever having seen the machine. He began by hypothesizing different possible mechanisms and testing each hypothesis against the intercepted messages. Could purple use rotating wheels like Enigma? The statistics suggested not. Could it use a plugboard system? Again, the evidence didn't fit. Friedman worked through dozens of possibilities, each time running into contradictions between his theories and the actual encrypted messages. It was frustrating, exhausting work that consumed his days and invaded his dreams. By late 1939, Friedman had assembled a small team of cryptanalysts to work on purple full-time. The team included some of the brightest mathematical minds in America. Frank Rowlett, a former high school mathematics teacher with an intuitive grasp of patterns. Abraham Sinkoff, a mathematician who specialized in probability theory. Solomon Kullback, an expert in statistical analysis. Together, they attacked purple from every angle, testing hypotheses, analyzing statistics, searching for the mathematical relationships that would unlock the cipher. They worked in secret, in a locked room in the munitions building, with armed guards outside the door. No one outside the team knew what they were working on. The pressure was intense. Months passed with little progress. The team could identify the two-group structure, could recognize certain patterns in how the cipher changed over time, but they couldn't break the actual encryption. They couldn't read the messages. Friedman drove himself relentlessly, working 16-hour days, filling notebooks with calculations and diagrams. His health began to suffer. He developed severe headaches, insomnia, digestive problems. His wife, Elizabeth, herself an accomplished cryptanalyst, begged him to slow down, to take care of himself. But Friedman couldn't stop. He was obsessed with purple, haunted by the encrypted messages that mocked him with their impenetrability. He knew the solution was there, hidden in the mathematics, waiting to be discovered. He just had to find it. Then, in September 1940, Frank Rowlett had a breakthrough. He was studying the 6-letter group, trying to understand how purple encrypted those particular letters, when he noticed something odd. The encryption pattern for these letters seemed to step through a sequence of changes, but the sequence wasn't smooth or continuous. Instead, it jumped in discrete steps, as if something was clicking from one position to another. Rowlett suddenly realized what he was looking at: telephone stepping switches. Purple wasn't using rotating wheels or plugboards. It was using telephone equipment, the same kind of automatic switching devices used in telephone exchanges to route calls. This was revolutionary. No one had ever used telephone switches in a cipher machine before, but it made perfect sense. Stepping switches could create complex, non-repeating patterns, and they were readily available commercial equipment. The discovery that Purple used telephone stepping switches transformed the code-breaking effort from theoretical cryptanalysis into practical engineering. William Friedman and his team now faced a new challenge. They had to build a working replica of the Purple machine based entirely on their mathematical analysis of encrypted messages. No one had ever attempted anything like this before. It was as if they'd been given a series of photographs taken with an unknown camera and asked to reconstruct the camera itself, down to the precise arrangement of lenses and shutters. The task seemed impossible, but Friedman believed it could be done. He had to believe it, because without a working Purple machine, American codebreakers would never be able to decrypt Japanese messages quickly enough to provide useful intelligence. Frank Rowlett took the lead on the engineering effort. He requisitioned telephone stepping switches from Bell Telephone Company, telling the suppliers only that they were needed for a classified government project. The switches arrived in unmarked crates, chunky electromechanical devices about the size of a fist, filled with rotating contacts and solenoids. Rowlett and his team began experimenting with different configurations, trying to determine how many switches Purple used and how they were connected. This was pure trial and error, guided by their understanding of how the cipher behaved. They knew that the 6-letter group required switches that could step through multiple positions. They knew that the encryption pattern repeated after a certain number of keystrokes. These constraints limited the possible configurations, but still left hundreds of potential arrangements to test. The work was maddeningly slow. Each time they built a test configuration, they had to wire it to typewriter keyboards, one for input, one for output, and then test it against known Purple messages. They would type in ciphertext and see if the output matched any plausible plain text. Most of the time, it didn't. The output was gibberish, indicating that their switch configuration was wrong. They would then modify the wiring, change the number of switches, adjust the stepping sequence, and test again. Failure after failure accumulated. Rowlett filled notebooks with circuit diagrams, each one crossed out when it failed to produce correct results. The team worked in shifts around the clock, driven by the knowledge that war was coming and that American lives might depend on their success. By December 1940, they had made significant progress on the 6-letter group. They had determined that Purple used 4 telephone stepping switches for these letters, arranged in a specific configuration that created a complex stepping pattern. When they wired up this configuration and tested it against intercepted messages, they got partial success. Some letters decrypted correctly, others didn't. This was encouraging. It meant they were close. The problem was the 20-letter group, which remained completely mysterious. Friedman's statistical analysis suggested that this group used a different encryption method, possibly a more traditional rotor system, but every configuration they tested failed. The 20-letter group seemed to resist all their efforts. Abraham Sinkoff proposed a radical idea. What if the 20-letter group also used stepping switches? but in a different configuration than the six-letter group. What if purple was entirely a stepping switch machine, with no rotors at all? This contradicted conventional wisdom about cipher machines, which typically used rotating wheels for encryption. But purple had already proven unconventional in its design. Friedman authorized Sinkoff to test the hypothesis. Sinkoff requisitioned more stepping switches and began building test configurations for the 20-letter group. He tried arrangements with 6 switches, 8 switches, 10 switches. He varied the wiring patterns, the stepping sequences, the initial positions. For weeks, nothing worked. Then, in late December, he tried a configuration with 6 switches, arranged in 2 banks of 3, with a specific cross-wiring pattern between them. When Sinkoff tested this configuration against a known purple message, the output was readable Japanese plaintext. For a moment, he thought he'd made an error, that he'd accidentally wired the machine backward or used plaintext as input instead of ciphertext. But when he checked his work, everything was correct. He had successfully decrypted a purple message. The 20-letter group configuration was solved. Sinkoff ran to Friedman's office, clutching the decrypted message, barely able to speak from excitement. Friedman read the plain text, a routine diplomatic message about trade negotiations, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful he had to sit down. After nearly 2 years of work, thousands of hours of analysis, countless failures and frustrations, they had done it. They had broken purple. But breaking the cipher and building a complete working machine were not the same thing. The team still had to integrate the 6-letter and 20-letter group configurations into a single device, figure out how purple switched between the 2 groups, and determine how the machine's settings changed daily. This required more analysis, more testing, more engineering. Friedman pushed the team harder than ever, knowing that time was running out. Intelligence reports indicated that Japan was preparing for major military operations. If war came before the purple machine was fully operational, American commanders would be blind to Japanese intentions. The team worked through Christmas and New Year's, sleeping in the office, eating at their desks, focused entirely on completing the machine. The breakthrough on the switching mechanism came from Solomon Kullback, who noticed that purple appeared to switch between the 6-letter and 20-letter groups based on the position of each letter in the alphabet. Vowels and certain consonants were encrypted using the 6-letter group. Other consonants used the 20-letter group. This was elegant and simple, requiring no additional mechanism beyond the basic switch banks. When Kullback implemented this switching logic in the test machine, everything suddenly worked. They could now decrypt purple messages from beginning to end, with complete accuracy. The machine they had built, an ungainly contraption of stepping switches, wires, and typewriter parts, looked nothing like what they imagined the actual purple machine looked like. But functionally, it was identical. In January 1941, the team demonstrated their purple machine to senior Army and Navy intelligence officers. They took an intercepted Japanese diplomatic message, fed the ciphertext into their machine, and watched as it typed out perfect Japanese plaintext. The officers were stunned. Some refused to believe it was real, suspecting some kind of trick. How could American cryptanalysts have built a working replica of a Japanese cipher machine without ever seeing the original? It defied logic. But the demonstration was genuine. Friedman's team had achieved the impossible through pure mathematical analysis and engineering brilliance. The United States now had the ability to read Japan's most secret diplomatic communications. The implications were staggering. With Purple broken, American intelligence could monitor Japanese diplomatic traffic worldwide. They could read messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies in Berlin, Rome, London, Washington. They could track Japanese negotiating positions, strategic assessments, intelligence reports. It was an intelligence windfall unlike anything in American history. But it also created enormous challenges. The Purple breakthrough had to be kept absolutely secret. If Japan discovered that their cipher was compromised, they would immediately switch to a new system, and all the work would be for nothing. Security around the Purple project became obsessive. The number of people who knew about the breakthrough was kept to an absolute minimum. Even high-ranking military officers were denied access unless they had a specific operational need to know. Friedman and his team built additional Purple machines, eventually producing several working units that were distributed to key intelligence centers. Each machine was kept under armed guard, in locked rooms with restricted access. The decrypted messages, codenamed Magic, were handled with extraordinary security measures. They were printed on special paper, delivered by hand to authorized recipients, and destroyed after reading. No copies were kept, except in a single, secure archive. The goal was to create a system where magic intelligence could be used to inform American strategy without ever revealing its source. It was a delicate balance, using the intelligence effectively while maintaining the fiction that Purple remained secure. The Purple machine hummed quietly in its locked room, its stepping switches clicking rhythmically as it transformed encrypted Japanese text into readable plaintext. Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer stood over the machine, watching the output typewriter spell out a message from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin to the foreign ministry in Tokyo. The message discussed German military preparations and Hitler's assessment of British resolve. It was exactly the kind of intelligence that American strategists desperately needed, and it was being delivered directly from Japanese diplomatic channels, with the Japanese having no idea their communications were compromised. Kramer carefully removed the decrypted message from the typewriter, placed it in a locked leather pouch, and prepared to deliver it to the handful of officials authorized to read Magic intelligence. The distribution of Magic was handled with paranoid secrecy. Only 9 people in the entire United States government had regular access to the decrypted messages. President Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark, and 3 senior intelligence officers. Even within this small group, strict protocols governed how magic could be used. Recipients were forbidden from taking notes, making copies, or discussing the intelligence with anyone not on the distribution list. The decrypted messages were delivered in locked pouches, read under supervision, and immediately retrieved for destruction. The goal was to ensure that no documentary trail existed that might reveal the source of the intelligence. This obsessive security created significant operational problems. Military commanders planning operations couldn't be told about magic, which meant they often lacked crucial intelligence about Japanese intentions and capabilities. Intelligence analysts, who could have provided context and interpretation, were denied access to the raw decrypts. Even within the small group of authorized recipients, the inability to discuss magic freely or share it with subordinates meant that its value was often diminished. There were times when magic provided clear warnings of Japanese actions, but the warnings couldn't be acted upon effectively because the commanders who needed the information weren't cleared to receive it. It was a frustrating paradox. America possessed an incredible intelligence advantage, but security concerns prevented its full exploitation. Despite these limitations, magic provided invaluable insights into Japanese strategy during the critical months of 1941. American diplomats negotiating with Japan knew exactly what instructions the Japanese ambassador was receiving from Tokyo, what Japan's bottom-line positions were, and how Japanese leaders assessed American resolve. This gave American negotiators an enormous advantage, though they had to be careful not to reveal their knowledge too obviously. Secretary of State Hull became adept at using magic intelligence subtly, steering negotiations in ways that appeared natural, but were actually informed by his complete knowledge of the Japanese position. It was diplomatic poker with marked cards, and Hull played the game skillfully. Magic also revealed the deteriorating relationship between Japan and the United States with stark clarity. Through the spring and summer of 1941, decrypted messages showed Japanese frustration with American economic sanctions, particularly the embargo on oil and scrap metal. Tokyo's messages to its ambassadors became increasingly pessimistic about the possibility of a negotiated settlement. Military preparations were discussed openly in diplomatic traffic, with Japanese diplomats instructed to assess American military readiness and report on fleet movements. To American intelligence analysts reading these messages, it became clear that Japan was preparing for war. The only questions were when and where the attack would come. In September 1941, magic intercepted a message that sent alarm bells ringing through American intelligence. The message, from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, requested detailed information about ship movements at Pearl Harbor, organized by specific locations within the harbor. This was far more detailed than routine intelligence gathering. It suggested that Japan was planning an operation against Pearl Harbor specifically. The message was circulated to the magic distribution list with an urgent notation. But the response was muted. Many senior officials found it difficult to believe that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, which was thousands of miles from Japanese territory and heavily defended. The prevailing assumption was that if Japan attacked American territory, it would be the Philippines, or perhaps Guam, targets much closer to Japanese bases. Throughout October and November, magic continued to intercept messages indicating Japanese military preparations. Diplomatic communications discussed deadlines for negotiations, beyond which things would automatically happen. Military attachés reported on American fleet dispositions and defensive preparations. Messages between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington showed that Japan was preparing for a breakdown in negotiations, with instructions for embassy staff to begin destroying code books and cipher machines. All of this pointed toward imminent Japanese military action. But where? Magic provided clear evidence of Japanese intentions, but frustratingly vague information about specific targets and timing. The challenge was that purple was a diplomatic cipher, used primarily by the foreign ministry and Japanese embassies. Military operations were planned and coordinated using different cipher systems, particularly the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, which American cryptanalysts had not yet broken. So while magic could reveal diplomatic maneuvering and general strategic intentions, it couldn't provide the specific operational details that would have allowed American commanders to prepare for specific attacks. It was like hearing one side of a telephone conversation. You could understand the general topic, but crucial details remained hidden. American intelligence knew that Japan was preparing for war, but they couldn't determine exactly when or where the blow would fall. In late November, Magic intercepted a message that became known as the Wind's Message. Tokyo instructed its embassies to listen for a specific phrase in Japanese radio broadcasts, "East wind, rain," which would signal that war with America was imminent. The embassies were instructed to immediately destroy all remaining cipher materials upon hearing this phrase. American intelligence began monitoring Japanese radio broadcasts around the clock, listening for the warning phrase. The tension in the intelligence community was palpable. Everyone knew that war was coming, that the Wind's message would provide perhaps a few hours' warning before Japanese forces struck. But where would they strike? The Philippines seemed most likely, but Pearl Harbor couldn't be ruled out, nor could the Panama Canal, or even the West Coast. On December 6, 1941, Magic intercepted a long message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. The message was transmitted in 14 parts, with the final part scheduled for delivery the following morning. The message was clearly important. It was encrypted using purple and marked for immediate attention. As the parts arrived, they were decrypted and rushed to the Magic distribution list. The message was Japan's final response to American diplomatic proposals, and it was clear from the tone that negotiations were over. The message didn't explicitly declare war, but it stated that further negotiations were impossible, and that Japan would take necessary measures to protect its interests. The final part, arriving early on December 7th, instructed the ambassador to deliver the message to Secretary of State Hull at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time. The timing was significant. Why would Japan specify such a precise delivery time for a diplomatic message? Intelligence analysts realized that the 1 p.m. delivery time must be coordinated with military action. Japan wanted to maintain the fiction of diplomatic propriety by delivering what amounted to a declaration of war just before attacking. But 1 p.m. Washington time corresponded to different times across the Pacific. In Hawaii, it would be 7:30 a.m. In the Philippines, it would be 1:30 a.m. the following day. Where was the attack coming? Urgent warnings were sent to American military commands across the Pacific, but the warnings were vague. Japanese action possible. Be alert. Because intelligence couldn't specify targets. In Hawaii, the warning arrived by commercial telegram, delayed by routine processing, and didn't reach commanders until after the attack had begun. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers screamed down on Battleship Row, while torpedo bombers skimmed across the water, launching their deadly payloads at the anchored American fleet. Within minutes, the harbor was transformed into an inferno of exploding ships, burning oil, and billowing smoke. The USS Arizona exploded catastrophically when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, killing over 1,000 sailors in an instant. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. the USS California, USS West Virginia, and USS Nevada all suffered severe damage. Across the harbor, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, hangars burned, and sailors and soldiers scrambled to mount a defense against an attack they hadn't anticipated. In Washington, it was early afternoon when news of the attack reached the Capitol. The Magic distribution list had been reading decrypted Japanese messages all morning, watching as the final parts of Tokyo's diplomatic message arrived and were delivered to Secretary Hull. The message itself had been anticlimactic, a formal statement ending negotiations, but containing no explicit declaration of war. Then, at approximately 2 p.m. Washington time, reports began flooding in from Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The Japanese had struck without warning, while their diplomats were still presenting their message to the State Department. The attack that American intelligence had known was coming, that Magic had warned about for months, had finally arrived, and it had achieved complete tactical surprise. The immediate question in the intelligence community was how this had happened. Magic had provided clear strategic warning. Decrypted messages had shown Japanese military preparations, diplomatic maneuvering, and even specific interest in Pearl Harbor. Yet the attack had caught the Pacific Fleet completely unprepared, with ships anchored in neat rows, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, and defensive measures at peacetime levels. The failure wasn't in intelligence collection. Magic had performed brilliantly, providing unprecedented access to Japanese diplomatic communications. The failure was in intelligence distribution, analysis, and action. The warnings had been too vague, too hedged with uncertainty, too restricted in distribution to enable effective defensive preparations. In the days following Pearl Harbor, there was intense soul-searching within the American intelligence community. William Friedman, exhausted and emotionally devastated by the attack, suffered a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. He had worked himself to the point of collapse breaking purple, believing that his success would help prevent exactly the kind of disaster that had just occurred. Now, despite having given American leaders the ability to read Japanese diplomatic communications, over 2,000 Americans were dead, and the Pacific Fleet was crippled. Friedman felt personally responsible, even though the failure was systemic rather than individual. His colleagues tried to reassure him that Magic had worked exactly as designed, that the problem was how the intelligence had been used, not how it had been collected. But Friedman couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he should have done more. The attack on Pearl Harbor, despite its devastating tactical success, actually validated the importance of Magic in a perverse way. In the months and years that followed as America mobilized for war, Magic became an increasingly vital intelligence source. Japan continued to use purple throughout the war, never suspecting that the cipher had been broken. Japanese diplomats around the world sent detailed reports to Tokyo using purple encryption, discussing everything from German military plans to assessments of American industrial capacity to negotiations with neutral countries. All of this was read in real time by American intelligence, providing strategic insights that shaped Allied war planning at the highest levels. Magic became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, known only to a handful of senior officials and protected with extraordinary security measures. The security surrounding Magic was so tight that even after the war, the American government refused to acknowledge its existence. When historians began writing accounts of Pearl Harbor and questioning why the attack had achieved surprise, despite various warning signs. The government couldn't explain that they had been reading Japanese diplomatic messages, because magic was still classified. This led to decades of conspiracy theories and accusations of government incompetence or even deliberate negligence. Some critics claimed that President Roosevelt had known about the attack in advance and allowed it to happen to bring America into the war. These theories were nonsense. Magic had provided strategic warning but not tactical intelligence about the specific attack. But the government couldn't refute them without revealing magic's existence. The truth about magic didn't begin to emerge until the 1970s, when the U.S. government finally declassified some of the purple-related materials. Even then, the full story remained obscured by continued classification of specific messages and operational details. It wasn't until the 1990s that historians gained access to comprehensive magic archives and could piece together the complete picture of what American intelligence had known before Pearl Harbor, how they had known it, and why that knowledge hadn't prevented the attack. The story that emerged was complex and nuanced, a tale of brilliant cryptanalytic success, undermined by bureaucratic failures, excessive secrecy, and the inherent difficulties of turning intelligence into action. For Japan, the continued use of purple throughout the war was a catastrophic security failure. Japanese diplomats and military attachés sent thousands of messages using purple encryption, believing their communications were secure. They reported on German military plans, discussed Japanese strategic assessments, evaluated Allied capabilities, and coordinated intelligence operations, all while American cryptanalysts read every word. The intelligence windfall was enormous. American strategists knew Japanese diplomatic positions in negotiations with the Soviet Union, understood Japanese assessments of German military capabilities, and could track Japanese intelligence operations worldwide. This information shaped Allied strategy in fundamental ways, from diplomatic initiatives to military operations. The Japanese never discovered that purple was compromised. Even after the war, when American occupation forces arrived in Japan and began examining Japanese military records, there was no indication that Japanese cryptographers had ever suspected their diplomatic cipher was broken. They had trusted in the mathematical complexity of the system, in the security of their key distribution procedures, in the supposed impossibility of building a purple machine without access to the original. That trust was misplaced, but it was understandable. What Friedman and his team had accomplished was genuinely extraordinary, breaking a cipher and building a working replica of an unknown machine using only mathematical analysis. It was one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and it remained secret for decades after the war ended. William Friedman eventually recovered from his breakdown and returned to cryptanalytic work, though he never fully recovered from the emotional trauma of Pearl Harbor. He continued to work in signals intelligence throughout the war and into the Cold War era, making additional breakthroughs in Soviet cipher systems. He was eventually recognized as the father of modern American cryptanalysis, though the specific details of his work on purple remained classified during his lifetime. When he died in 1969, his obituaries mentioned his contributions to cryptography in general terms, but couldn't describe his greatest achievement, the breaking of purple, because it was still classified. Only later did the full story emerge, revealing the magnitude of what he and his small team had accomplished in those desperate years before Pearl Harbor. When World War II ended in August 1945, the United States possessed the most sophisticated signals intelligence apparatus in the world. The small team that William Friedman had assembled to break Purple had grown into a massive organization employing thousands of cryptanalysts, linguists, engineers, and support staff. They had broken not only Purple but dozens of other Japanese cipher systems, as well as German, Italian, and other Axis codes. The intelligence derived from these breakthroughs, collectively known as Ultra for European Theater and Magic for Pacific Theater, had contributed significantly to Allied victory. Military historians later estimated that signals intelligence had shortened the war by at least a year, saving hundreds of thousands of lives and preventing incalculable destruction. Yet even in victory, the story of Purple remained hidden. When the war ended, the American and British governments made a deliberate decision to keep their cryptanalytic successes completely secret. There were several reasons for this decision. First, they wanted to continue using the same techniques against the Soviet Union, which was rapidly emerging as a new adversary. If the world learned that Enigma and Purple had been broken, the Soviets would immediately strengthen their own cipher systems, closing off valuable intelligence sources. Second, many countries were still using cipher machines based on Enigma technology, purchased as war surplus or copied from captured German equipment. As long as these countries believed the machines were secure, American and British intelligence could continue reading their communications. The secrecy was maintained with extraordinary discipline. Thousands of people had worked on Ultra and Magic during the war, but they were sworn to silence and threatened with prosecution if they revealed anything about their work. The Purple machines themselves were destroyed or locked away in classified archives. Documents related to the code-breaking efforts were classified at the highest levels. When military histories of the war were written in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they made no mention of signals intelligence breakthroughs. Commanders who had made decisions based on decrypted enemy communications were forced to attribute their knowledge to other sources: reconnaissance, captured documents, prisoner interrogations, anything but the truth. It was a massive rewriting of history, done in the name of national security. This secrecy created distorted historical narratives that persisted for decades. The attack on Pearl Harbor was portrayed as a complete intelligence failure, with no mention of Magic's warnings. The Battle of Midway, where American forces ambushed a Japanese fleet thanks to broken Japanese naval codes, was attributed to lucky reconnaissance. The assassination of Admiral Yamamoto, whose travel plans were known through decrypted messages, was described as a chance encounter. Countless other operations that had been enabled or informed by signals intelligence were explained through conventional means. Historians working without access to classified materials drew incorrect conclusions about why certain decisions were made and how certain victories were achieved. The true story of the war couldn't be told because the most important source of intelligence remained secret. The first cracks in the secrecy appeared in the 1970s. In 1974, a British intelligence officer named F.W. Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret, which revealed for the first time that Britain had broken the German Enigma cipher during the war. The revelation was sensational, forcing the British government to acknowledge what it had denied for 3 decades. The American government, facing pressure to declassify its own signals intelligence records, began releasing some magic-related documents in the mid-1970s. But the declassification was selective and slow, with many documents remaining classified for national security reasons. It wasn't until the 1990s that substantial magic archives were opened to researchers, allowing historians to finally understand the full scope of American cryptanalytic achievements. What emerged from these declassified documents was a story of remarkable intellectual achievement combined with significant operational failures. The breaking of Purple was a triumph of mathematical cryptanalysis, demonstrating that even sophisticated machine ciphers could be defeated through systematic analysis. Friedman and his team had essentially invented modern cryptanalysis, developing techniques that are still used today. They had proven that cipher security depends not just on the complexity of the encryption algorithm, but on the entire system: key management, operational procedures, traffic analysis, vulnerabilities. Purple was mathematically strong, but it was broken because Japanese operators followed predictable patterns, because diplomatic messages contained stereotyped language, and because the same cipher was used for both routine and sensitive communications. The operational failures around Pearl Harbor revealed the challenges of turning intelligence into action. Magic had provided strategic warning that Japan was preparing for war, but strategic warning isn't the same as tactical intelligence. Knowing that an attack is coming somewhere sometime isn't enough to mount an effective defense. The excessive secrecy around magic meant that commanders who needed intelligence to make decisions were often denied access. The small distribution list meant that only a handful of senior officials saw the raw decrypts, and they often lacked the context or expertise to interpret them correctly. There was no systematic process for analyzing magic intelligence, integrating it with other sources, and producing actionable assessments. These were hard lessons, learned at terrible cost. In the decades after World War II, these lessons shaped the development of modern intelligence organizations. The National Security Agency, created in 1952 to consolidate American signals intelligence efforts, built on the foundation that Friedman and his colleagues had established. NSA developed systematic approaches to intelligence analysis, created broader distribution systems that balanced security with operational needs, and invested heavily in both cryptanalysis and communication security. The agency became the world's premier signals intelligence organization, employing tens of thousands of people and operating with a budget in the billions of dollars. All of this traced back to the small team that had broken Purple in a locked room in the munitions building in 1940. The Purple story also highlighted the eternal tension between codemakers and codebreakers. Every encryption system, no matter how sophisticated, is vulnerable to cryptanalysis if enough resources are devoted to breaking it. The Japanese believed Purple was unbreakable because they understood its mathematical complexity and couldn't imagine how it could be defeated without access to the machine itself. They were wrong, but their mistake was understandable. Even today, with computers millions of times more powerful than anything available in the 1940s, the fundamental challenge remains the same: creating encryption systems that can protect information against determined adversaries with vast resources. Modern encryption relies on mathematical problems that are believed to be computationally intractable, but believed to be isn't the same as proven to be. The possibility always exists that someone, somewhere, will find a breakthrough that renders current encryption obsolete. The human element of the Purple story remains compelling. William Friedman's obsessive dedication to breaking the cipher, his nervous breakdown after Pearl Harbor, his lifetime of service to American intelligence. These speak to the personal costs of intelligence work. Frank Rowlett's intuitive leap about telephone stepping switches, Abraham Sinkov's persistence in testing configuration after configuration, Solomon Kullback's insight about the switching mechanism. These moments of individual brilliance made the breakthrough possible. But so did the thousands of hours of tedious work, the endless statistical calculations, the careful record-keeping, the systematic testing of hypotheses. Breaking Purple required both genius and grinding effort, inspiration, and perspiration. For Japan, the Purple failure was a catastrophic intelligence disaster that was never fully recognized or acknowledged. Japanese cryptographers had created what they believed was an unbreakable cipher, and they were so confident in its security that they never seriously considered the possibility of compromise. Even when there were hints that something might be wrong, when American diplomats seemed unusually well informed about Japanese positions, when military operations encountered unexpected opposition, Japanese intelligence never suspected that their diplomatic cipher had been broken. This failure of imagination, this inability to question fundamental assumptions, cost Japan dearly throughout the war. It's a lesson that remains relevant today. The greatest security vulnerabilities are often not technical, but psychological. The assumption that our systems are secure, that our adversaries are less capable than they actually are, that what seems impossible really is impossible. Today, the original Purple machines that Friedman's team built are museum pieces, displayed at the National Cryptologic Museum in Maryland. They look primitive compared to modern encryption technology, bulky assemblages of telephone switches and wiring connected to mechanical typewriters. But they represent one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the 20th century. These machines, built without ever seeing the original Japanese equipment, demonstrated the power of mathematical analysis and human ingenuity. They helped win a war, shaped the development of modern intelligence agencies, and established principles of cryptanalysis that remain fundamental today. The story of Purple is ultimately a story about the power of ideas, the importance of persistence, and the reality that in the secret world of codes and ciphers, nothing is ever truly unbreakable.